So hello and welcome to part 3 of our database series here with Rackforms, working with SQL Plus specifically. What's going to be interesting about this video is I wanted to give for what it's worth, the most realistic portrayal of what's involved with this process. That is, writing to a database, working with Rackforms. And so I actually have not prepared in any way for this video. I'm just going to explore the data along with you in real time, and we're going to figure out how we can write to these database tables here. In the end, what we should hopefully have is a form that is much smarter than what we currently have, right? So right now, all we're doing is just writing into this track table without any regard to the track ID, the artist ID, or album ID. We're just blindly sending stuff in there. And again, as we kind of hopefully described in the last video, that is going to lead to huge problems because our data is not going to be structured in a way that makes sense at all. So that's what we're going to do here is we're going to write to it in a smart manner. So first things first then, we need to make our form a little bit smarter. Now, traditionally, that is going to mean instead of using raw text fields right here for entering our artist and album, we're probably going to have a select menu. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a select menu to this form, and I'm going to call this artist. And I'm actually going to just copy this artist ID value right here and call this field artist ID instead. And then I'm going to delete the artist ID field. So what my goal here is I want to populate this select menu with dynamic values from the artist table, right? I want to grab these artist IDs and artist names and write them to the database. Or excuse me, query them and then write them to this dropdown right here. So to do that, it's actually pretty simple. I'm just going to scroll down here, and I'm going to get down to data source, and I'm going to toggle on dynamic query. Right, we're going to use dynamic data here. I'm then going to put in my database field name. So I'm going to put in 127001. I'm going to put in my database name of music, and my user again is Rackforms with the password of test. And so we should be able to hook up to the database just right. And now I'm going to write my query. So what I want to do is I want to grab artist ID and artist name from this database. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say select. And I'm going to notice here that we query and populate by label and value. So I'm going to say select artist name, comma, artist underscore ID from artist. Let's just see what this looks like first, and we'll kind of explain it here. So you can see here that I have the artist, and the artist ID is actually hiding as the value of this form field. So let's go ahead and look at the source code for this. You can see here that indeed the artist ID for 1 is new order. The artist ID for Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds is right there. It's set, and so on and so forth. So this is the first really important lesson here. So we're working with structured data like this. We're almost always going to have two representations of the data. The friendly view, which is what your user sees, and then the technical view, which is how we tie things together. Recall that in track right here, artist ID, let me actually get rid of my dummy value here, delete row. Artist ID for this song is 1. Therefore, artist 1 is new order. So when I'm relating new tracks, when I'm putting them into this database table right here, I need to make sure that I'm not putting for artist ID the name of the artist. I need to put the artist ID in there, right? So artist ID has to equal 1. Therefore, when I write my query, because we populate it as label value, the label for the form field is artist name, but the value, this 1 right here, comes from artist ID. Very, very important. Now we could populate this just by saying select artist name. The problem with doing this, however, let's go ahead and open Firebug again, is that when I look at the source code for this dropdown right here, now it doesn't actually have those numbers for the value. It just uses the label right here. In some cases, this is what we want, but for this particular database, is definitely not what we want. We need to make sure that we're actually getting the artist ID, so that when we write to the track table, that's what we're putting in, is a proper artist ID. Now, as a small review for that, let's do the exact same thing, but for album. So go ahead and I'll click album here, and I'll just say drop a select item right below that. I'm going to copy my ID out here. Recall here, I should actually mention that name value and ID are almost always the same. So you may see me in videos just kind of interchangeably selecting these right here. So I'll put in the name value right here, album ID, and then I want to grab the text album so that our users knows that that's what this field is. Oops, looks like I didn't quite copy it right there. It's all right, let's type it in. And then I'll get rid of this field because we don't need it anymore. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually do a little bit of shortcutting right here. So I'm going to say for this artist, this first one we filled right here, because I had to kind of fill out these values for database host name and database name and whatnot, I don't have to keep typing that. So I'm actually going to click this apply settings to all data source items right here. And that's simply going to say this guy, this album, because we haven't filled these out yet, it's just going to pre-fill those based on these values, right? So select artist, say apply settings to all database items, and now this album right here has all my database settings in there. It's a nice little shortcut. Now, as far as the select statement, if we go to some populating album now, if I look at album, you can see here that I have album ID and album name. So let's just do that. So we're going to select, recall here, label value. So the label is the first. So I want album name, comma, album ID from, and our table name is album. So now let's make sure that runs. So we're getting an artist, and now we're getting no album. All right, let's see what happened here. So we have album name, album ID from album. We didn't turn on dynamic query. Now we run it, we should have our albums in here. Okay, so now that we have our dynamic data actually populating, now I feel much better about writing to our track database right here, right? Because now we know that when I fill out this form, a user has to select from one of these valid items right here. Now, the last thing I should do, however, though, is put in a field for track ID. And again, track ID is simply which number on the CD the track is. So this is somewhat arbitrary because, again, I don't actually have any real data here. But to do that, I'm just going to select a track field right here, and I'll just put in, very simply, track ID, right? And then for its field, track underscore ID. Now, just reviewing real quickly, track ID, this is what our user sees, again, but this name value right here has to match with the database column name, right? Track ID, track ID. Actually, let me be very careful and say that it doesn't have to match with the database column name. It just makes life much easier when we do that, because then we can use the SQL Plus Automator tool, or if we're writing our queries by hand, we can use the database select item. So, okay, so we're almost done now. We're going to be getting valid values from artist and album. So let's go ahead and write our query now. Of course, we're not going to write it by hand. I'm just going to right click. I'm going to go down to SQL Plus Automator, select MySQL, and it's going to fill in my table name again here. So I want track. And let's just review the fields that we have right here. So I have track name. Let's actually scoot this over. That looks good. Track ID. Track ID looks good. It's right there. Artist ID. Sure enough, we got artist ID, album ID, and time. So I'm going to say, again, we have lots of different options here. In this case, I just want an insert item, right? I want the SQL Plus insert item. So I'll just click that, and that's exactly what RackForms creates for us. I can then, of course, check this guy out right here and just make sure. Again, you don't have to know SQL to do this, but just kind of looking at this here, I can see that insert into track, track name, ID, artist. This all looks perfect right here. So let's give this a shot and see what happens. Actually, let me turn on debug here. So for track name, I'm going to say sample song. For track ID, we'll just say this is track ID 1. Actually, let's start at 0 because it seems like that's what this database starts at. For the artist end, I'll just select new order. The album is retro. And then for time, we'll say 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Now, I've kind of set us up for failure right here. This is going to cause an error right here. And when I hit submit, you'll see that because, and this is really the lesson here, because I turned on error reporting for this guy, we get a nice, pretty message here. It just says incorrect decimal value 330 for column time. Now, that error basically means that I put in a string value instead of a decimal value. So you notice here, if I look at my time column, this isn't actually in the format of 4 and then a colon like this. It's actually just a period. So to address this error, I'm simply going to change this colon to a period. And now when I submit this right here, we're going to get another duplicate key entry error. Now this is actually totally okay right here, because if you think about it, this track ID, artist ID, and UMID combination is already taken for us, right? So this is actually not a problem. To actually fix this, I could just do something like this. Track ID, I could put in some number like 22, and now it'll actually insert into the table just fine. Now the reason why I did that though, and by the way, here's our sample song. The reason why I did that is this actually gets us to the last point here, which we're going to cover in the final video, which is some cleanup remarks about how structured data works in some of the ways that we would actually improve upon this form to make it even a little bit more smart yet. So I hope you join us for that.